This is Duke University.
Thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Surprise Endings. Our topic for today will be race, prejudice, and political correctness. We're joined today by Professor Kathy Davidson and visiting Professor Adeline Koh. So we're really lucky to have them here today. Professor Koh is actually the inventor of the game Trading Races. Now I won't get into it too much because we want to hear from the inventor herself. So could you tell us a little bit about your game and the inspiration for it?
Sure. Trading Races is a historical role-playing game that's set at the University of Michigan in 2003. And the game is designed for students to learn about race consciousness in an undergraduate classroom. And students who are playing the game play a combination of real historical characters such as Sandra Day O'Connor, Warwick Connolly, Bell Hooks, and John Hope Franklin, who's also in the game, as well as an imaginary multi-ethnic and multicultural student assembly. And by playing the game, the students are supposed to make a decision on the fate of affirmative action at the University of Michigan. So it's a paper-based role-playing game, which means that it works like Dungeons and Dragons. So it works like Dungeons and Dragons, not World of Warcraft right now. We are trying to work on an online version with a Greater Than Games lab, and so eventually we hope that we will turn it into World of Warcraft, but with more ethical and political underlying motives. And right now it has been play tested one time at the Franklin Humanities Institute in December with a number of the people who work at the center and a number of faculty. And we're also going to be playing it in Professor Adeline Koh's class in Chinatowns in April. And I was just telling Billy that you guys are invited to come and watch playing of the game and film the game if you would like.
Great. So you said you've played it once. So a lot of the questions that the students asked were sort of what were some long-term trends you saw in these students? You know, once they played, did they change their ideology based on just a few hours of playing in character? But that changed their perception long-term of these ideas?
One thing that I noticed from the comments is there was a misconception that the game only lasted a few hours. The game actually is supposed to last 9 class sessions. So that means that it'll be like 9 1-hour, 1.5-hour sessions, and the first 3 sessions will be set up, which means that the professor does everything he or she normally does, which is contextualize the readings for you and have a discussion about the readings before the game actually starts, before everybody actually gets into character. The last session is the post-mortem of the game, where we talk about how the game diverged from history, if it did diverge from history, and the reasons for that, and how the personalities or what happened in the game could have affected that change in history. So to answer your question, the game hasn't been played by students, by undergraduate students yet. It has been tested by people who have PhDs, most of them, or who are professors, so I don't know. I'm really, really excited to find out. The game is going to be play tested, like I said, in Professor Adeline Koh's class this semester, and it's also going to be tested at a class in my home institution, which is Richard Stockton College in New Jersey, by an undergraduate history class there. And after both classes play the game, we're going to plan a Skype postmortem for the 2 classes to talk to each other about their experiences playing the game. And then we'll probably have more data about the results and how people actually felt that it changed. But from the people who have already played the game, I had Beth Perry, who is an associate director of the institute here, and she's very pro-affirmative action. And I cast her in the role of Warwick Connolly, and Warwick Connolly is an African-American, very conservative person who's a big proponent against affirmative action, and who actually led a referendum against affirmative action in the state of California. And she played Warwick Connolly, and she was saying that she just hated playing him because she really didn't want to take on an opinion like that. But she said that through playing the game, she really explored a different ideology that she never would have taken seriously before. Now, and at points, she even got a little confused about where she really was. And that's kind of the point of the game, to inhabit something so completely, or to attempt to inhabit something so completely that you kind of forget your own point of view.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
A few years ago when I was writing Now You See It, I interviewed somebody who had a company in New York who said she played, at the time, Second Life was popular,
Yeah.
which it's not anymore, but at the time, it allowed characters, people in her company, to take on the roles of other people in the company.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, she said, sometimes people felt almost traumatized by it, because in Second Life, they would see the way people would react to them.
Right.
And one of the people in the company, who was kind of a athletic, good-looking Caucasian woman, was playing the role of somebody who was not only African-American and a little overweight, but whose face was quite plain. And this was a woman who was used to the world kind of smiling at her.
Right.
And she was shocked. In Second Life, played as a character, her avatar walked into a group, and people not only didn't turn to talk to her, but often would turn away from her to talk, or would talk to one another as if she wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I talked to, I interviewed, said it was kind of an unforgettable experience, because you don't often get to inhabit another person's skin and see the world reacts to you as somebody who isn't you. And even doing it with all the goofy levers and codes and things you do, and headset and stuff you do with Second Life, it felt real in a different way than reading about it in a book, because suddenly, hey, this is my character, why aren't you reacting to me? And she just couldn't get people's attention in the same way. And she said that was the one, wasn't what people said about her or to her, it was just her invisibility that just was shocking.
Could I respond to that? It actually reminds me of a lot of discussions that we've been having about my game, because right now, like I said, it's paper-based, so you play act in person. Like, so basically, I have a Professor Chow, who's an Asian American woman, and I cast her into the role of a white woman that was defending affirmative action because she grew up with an African American best friend. This is the fictional character that she was in. And so when playing the game, obviously we don't look like what our characters are supposed to look like. So we have some kind of a marker to show what we're supposed to look like. And that was very interesting, because one of the players of the game said that she felt like she could say a lot of things and she could get away with it because she's African American, and she could say a lot of conservative white things that she could not get away with if she were white. And I had a white man who was playing bell hooks, who was saying,
I know bell hooks. Oh wow, very well.
Oh, she might like to read the game. And he was saying that he was very comfortable playing bell hooks because he works on Caribbean history and African American history. But I think he said he would have been very uncomfortable if he was playing a very conservative white character, because he is not conservative himself.
Oh, interesting.
So our shift towards the online platform is really our attempt to model like what you're saying. What happens when people don't regard you with that kind of avatar? Because right now, as the game stands, the game isn't really so much about trading races. I know I called it that, but it's sexier than actually what it really is, which is trading ideological perspectives. Which is actually what the game is about.
But trading races is a better type.
Right.
Right.
And you learn these ideological perspectives, and I noticed a lot of the comments touched on this idea as well. How do you really empathize and inhabit a point of view that's so different from your own? And this game makes you do that not by imagining, really, but by reading. So it's really a game that you do everything that you normally would in a class. You read books, you write papers, you give presentations, but you do it all in character. So if you have a particular character, you have to look at the assigned readings of your character. You have to write papers in the voice of your character, so that you can really occupy the ideological position of your character. You're not just imagining it from what you already know. You have to learn something in order to play your character.
It's similar to writing a novel, where you're having to be honest and true to each of the characters, even if you despise those characters.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the reading experience of reading literature, is that you're constantly seeing different if it's a good work, full realized human beings interacting with each other, which is really different than having an article or a statistic here and then a different set of statistics and arguments here, and trying to figure out which you prefer. This is really all the complexity, which is not ever clean.
Right.
Right? There might be contradictions within. Well, for all of us, right? There's contradictions within all of us.
And the interesting thing about these reacting to the past games is that every character has a different set of victory goals. And so there are 3 factions.
That's built into the game.
It's built into the game. So there's a pro-affirmative action faction, there's an anti-affirmative action faction, and there's a group of indeterminates. And so the factions obviously want to win. They want to push forward their goals of being against or either affirmative, of being for or against affirmative action. But even within the group, they have different objectives, which is just like in real life. Everybody has a different objective. Everybody has a different set of agendas. And nobody really completely knows what the other group's agenda is. And each person within the faction may have an agenda that competes with somebody else in the faction.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Something that we discussed and something that we're really interested in is sort of real-life political or real-life implications for this. So who would be using this game, in what scope would it be used, and sort of how can it be valuable to maybe companies, workplaces, things like that?
You know, that's a really great question, and I just wanted to echo what Kathy said. I read your blog post, and I was really impressed at the level of engagement and how seriously you were really thinking about these issues. And what you just asked was one of those questions that really impressed me. I think the sky might be the limit. I don't know. Right now, I would like to see the game being played in an undergraduate classroom because that's what it's designed for. I would also hope that the game could be used in upper-level high school classes for race and ethnicity. And I really want the game to be taught along other reacting to the past games that are touching on race and ethnicity. So I held a conference here early in January at Duke to introduce the pedagogy of reacting to the past to instructors and faculty from around the area and from the United States more generally. And I had Mark Higbee, who's a professor at Eastern Michigan University. He designed a really cool game called Frederick Douglass, Slavery and Abolition. And that game really is about slavery and abolition in the 19th century. And you have people who want to continue with slavery, people who are against slavery, and indeterminates. And when I first played that game, I was Walt Whitman, so it was very cool. So I would really like my game to be played along with other games, such as the Frederick Douglass game, to bring students the perspective of understanding race, not just in 2003. The reason why I located the game in 2003 because I thought it was a very familiar setting for today's student to be able to get into and empathize with. But if combined with understanding a 19th century historical perspective on race, I think would give a very well-rounded experience of learning about race in the college classroom.
Interesting. So I'd like to move on now to one of the things we had our students watch was a PBS documentary called Class Divided. This took place in the late 1960s, and a third grade teacher arbitrarily divided her class based on blue-eyed and brown-eyed students, and so she said that the blue-eyed students were better, sort of mimicking the racial segregation that was taking place during the day. This received a lot of backlash, sort of not surprisingly, but Kathy, I'm sort of interested in your perspective on this. Was this an ethical study, or was it important to the political discourse of the day?
Well, I think, the backlash was because it was a very, very heated time when it was created, and the historical context of the making of the documentary was interesting. But I think what's interesting is when you look at it in retrospect, to see the controversy as part of the issue itself, and to see the whole thing as almost an ecology of ideas about what race is, but also about what you are or are allowed to expose children to or are not allowed to expose children to. And I think, to me, one of the things that's really deep, deep, deep in that study is it fair to tell little kids early on that society is going to load the deck for you or against you, and why? It's because the whole ideology of this country, of the United States, is that we are on a level playing field, and as long as you have merit, and as long as you're excellent, you're going to thrive. And as long as you work hard, you're going to thrive. So I feel like that study was one of the things that really tapped into with some very, very basic American ideals. And part of the outrage was undercutting or challenging the idea that, in fact, everybody has the same opportunities. Or what it's like when you're told as a child, you have blue eyes, you're superior, you have brown eyes, you're inferior. We don't like that word, right? Land of democracy, freedom for all. We don't like that, to have certain people as a group arbitrarily assign more or less freedom or possibility than another. So I think for me historically, one of the things that's so interesting about the game, about that documentaries to think about what it means for our own ideology now as Americans. And also think about how much that's changed. I think in some ways it looks like a more naive documentary in retrospect.
All right, so we are here today with the James B. Duke Professor of Behavioral Economics, Dan Ariely. Dan, thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
So today we'll be discussing race, prejudice, and political correctness with Dan. So to start off with, we're just interested in some of the experiments that Dan's done related to these. So Dan, what's some of your research regarding these topics?
So this is not really my area of research, but I've done a couple of projects. One project was, we call it the PC game. And the way it worked was the following. We had two people, each of them looking at the computer screen, and one of them had one picture, and one of them had 20 pictures. And the person with the 20 pictures had to guess which one of the 20 pictures was the one picture that the other person has. And they could only ask questions that has to do with yes or no. Is the person standing or sitting? Is there a tree in the picture? Yes or no? Stuff like that. And race was a very good indicator. Half the pictures were of people who were white, half the people black. And the question was, would people use the race? And the first thing we found out is that people did not use race enough. It's a really good question. And when we show people these as shapes, they use color. But when we show people, they don't use as color. Also, when they use color, were much more likely to say, is the person white, rather than saying, is the person black or is the person African American? But the other thing we did was we changed the second person they were asking. So if we change that person from being a white Confederate, the other person worked for us. If we change them from being white to being black, all of a sudden people use race much less. So if I talk to you and you're white and I'm white, I'm happier to use race. But if you were African American, all of a sudden I would be a bit more apprehensive. Now, noticing colors doesn't make you racist. But I think people are so concerned about that they pretend to even not notice color. And the funniest version was when we called the game the FBI Most Wanted game. And you sat together with an African American Confederate and you called it the FBI Most Wanted game. Now people basically didn't use race at all, because now it really falls into stereotypes. The other curious thing about this, though, is that people did it because they wanted the Confederate to like them. Right? So if you and I played and you were African American and we called this the FBI Most Wanted game, I would not notice race because I don't want you to think bad of me. I mean, that's the reason for it. But what they actually did was they didn't look at the person in the eyes as much. They were so concerned that they actually basically kept on looking around the room rather than trying to make a connection, and actually were much less likable because of that. So the idea is that we have this desire to be seen as not prejudiced. It broadens to even things that have nothing to do with prejudice. For example, noticing race. But this concern that runs within us make us so apprehensive that it actually makes us less social.
When Kathy was talking, I was reminded of how I've structured my game. The central premise of my game is actually about this distinction between color blindness and color consciousness. So instead of being for or against affirmative action, that's the way I explain it to people when we play the game. If you read the game, you either be in a faction that's color blind or color conscious. And it's very interesting that these two ideological perspectives are very connected in a lot of ways, because people who are against affirmative action often use one of the most colorblind rhetoric, and I saw that in some of the comments as well. Martin Luther King's speech is all about colorblindness. I don't want my kids to be judged on the color of their skin, but the content of their character, right? So that is all about color blindness, and so ultimately the goal is supposed to be about color blindness. And one of the readings that you read also saying that in order not to appear racist, people want to affect a kind of color blindness. But on the other side, people who opt for color consciousness argue that color blindness is not possible. It is not possible. It is simply there. You notice color, you notice differentiations between people. That's the way human beings work. And one thing that the color conscious faction will point out in the game is what in race studies is called white privilege, and the concept of privilege. People who are of a privileged group do not ever need to notice something if they don't want to notice something. So the argument is, about white privilege, is that if you have white privilege, you're privileged because you don't need to notice race. In other words, if you are made to notice race, you don't have that privilege. And you can ignore that you are not white all you want, but the world will tell you that you are not white. And so in that regard, I think this game reminds me a lot about, the game that you were talking about reminds me a lot about this invisibility that goes on. So I think the person who wrote the game that you're talking about was trying to point at the arbitrariness of a distinction. An arbitrariness that is made very, very clear to us because it seems absurd. But privilege in our everyday lives is so internalized that we don't even notice that it's there. It's arbitrary, but it's not arbitrary because it seems to be natural.
I have two anecdotes to add to that, one about Canada and one about Japan. When I first lived in Japan, and first taught in Japan, I lived in a little town where there was one other Caucasian woman. She had to be French. I'm 5'7½", she's 4'11". She's very voluptuous. At the time I had very long hair, she had short hair, and people would see us in the supermarket and come up to me and say, now, are you the American woman who teaches at Kobe Jogakuin, or are you the French woman who's married to the Japanese musician? And I'd say, I'm the sensei at Kobe Jogakuin. Oh, okay. And a week later, the same person would say, now, which one are you again? And it was fantastic to be in that situation where I would look at my friend Marivan and think, we looked nothing alike, except we did, because we were both white ladies. And in a Japanese village, all people were remembering is, oh, that white lady. And they literally could not keep us apart. And then people would often, when we traveled together, tell us all the time, oh, are you two sisters? You look just alike. We think, wow, we don't look alike at all. But in other contexts, we wouldn't have been said that we looked alike. But when your frame is white lady, we were sisters. We looked exactly alike. My other one is a really different one, a funny one. Someone many, many, many years ago asked a Prime Minister of Canada why it was that Canadians knew everything about American history, but Americans knew hardly anything about Canada. And he said, well, it's kind of like sleeping, being an elephant, and sleeping in bed with a mouse. Because if you're a mouse, an elephant, you really don't have to know very much about whether the mouse is turning and where it is in the bed. But if you're the mouse, you sure as heck better know where the elephant was. And that seems to me a really great, funny way of thinking about privilege, that you have to pay attention in a different way when you are the powerful than you do when you're the mouse, knowing that that elephant can squish you if you happen to turn or be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Kathy, that's going to be in a comic later today. No, I'm serious. I just started with a friend of mine, Rupika Ritsam, who's at Emory, a Tumblr blog on post-colonial digital humanities comics, and so
yes, it's Pierre Trudeau who is the person who Pierre Trudeau is that, who himself, that was interesting because he's French Canadian, was the Prime Minister of Canada a long, long time ago. But it's a comic that's often quoted. It's pretty clever.
Yeah. So I think that idea that we were talking about before of racial consciousness versus blindness is really interesting. So taking a step back and looking at society today, is racial blindness realistic, or is racial consciousness more of a realistic goal that we should be striving for? Either of you guys can take that.
Well, I think most race and ethnicity professors would say that in order for race not to become a problem or not to be recognized, we need to really recognize it in all its forms. Because to pretend that it's not there is really not solve the problem, but it's to ignore something but actually have the undercurrents play out and be problematic. So we need to be conscious of color, that we are making decisions based upon color, and be self-critical of those decisions that we're making.
What about you, Kathy?
Yeah, I think I've not heard it stated quite like that, Adeline, but I really like the way that's stated, that unless you understand what color, unless you're color conscious about color blindness, you're never going to solve the problem of racism.
Right.
Yeah, so in the PBS documentary that we were talking about, the teacher actually noticed a difference in test scores between the sort of the upper group, the blue-eyed versus the brown-eyed. So do you think, taking a step back and looking at this in perspective today, do you think that this sort of perceived, lower upper value has an effect on the achievement gap that we see today in society?
That experiment was repeated in a different, more IRB-approved way about 4 or 5 years ago, where all you had to do was say to somebody before they were taking a test some comment tangentially about their race, and the white kids did better than they had done on a similar test with a control group, and the African-American kids did worse. Just by making a seemingly scattered comment, a non-racist scattered comment, just reminding people that race is an issue. So I think we don't, I think what we know is that it deeply influences us in ways we don't know. That it's so profound, and this is what attention blindness is. This is the cultural dimension of attention blindness. When we have certain values that we're absorbing from the time we're born, we don't see them anymore. That's that phrase that we've used in here before, where we talk about being reflexive about our reflective about our reflexes. We don't know what our habits are until we have an experiment or a great work of literature or a game that points out our own assumptions, because we've inhabited them so long. It's so hard to see outside of ourselves and look back at ourselves. And that's true for so many things. We know, for example, that babies are born being able to tell the smells that are their culture smells versus other culture smells, because you have olfactory nerves at around about the 7th month of gestation as a fetus. So when you're born into the world, you already have an ecology of smells that you associate, and tastes that you associate. When you bring another taste or smell into that world, you can see there's many experiments with babies. They perk up and they know something different is happening. By the time a baby is about 6 months old, it's not just different, but they've inherited the fears, prejudices, assumptions of their immediate affectional group, telling them that's not just different, it's wrong, it's bad, it's negative. If there's a nanny from a different race who embodies those smells, there's often a ambivalence, and there's especially around the age of 2, there's a kind of a split perspective where the child has to try to figure out, wow, how does this category work? Because I've got this category that the world around me is saying is a bad category, but this person I love so much, my nanny, is in that category. And sometimes kids will go through a period where they confuse it, and if you ask a 2-year-old the race of their nanny, if it's a different race, they'll switch it. And what they're really doing is saying, I want this nanny to have the value that the other people around me put on that race.
Right.
It's pretty poignant to see these things. With iPads, we get much more insight into the ideology of children and what babies are absorbing, because we have an interface that allows that. It's kind of scary and sad to see how early children are absorbing the prejudices of their society. And if you've been doing it since you're 6 months old or 2 years old, how do you know at age 20 what prejudices you inhabit?
There's a early 20th century, 19th century parallel to that. I think it's Ann Stoler, but I'm not completely sure. She writes on colonial Indonesia and the Dutch and colonial Indonesia and mixed race, the effects of métissage and mixed race marriage. And I think it was her, somebody did a survey of women's magazines in the early 20th century on Dutch colonial women who went to Indonesia and how they were supposed to be, what kind of house they were supposed to keep, how they were supposed to dress. And these magazines actually had a section where if they had a domestic help, an Indonesian domestic worker, they had to ask the worker to hold the baby away from them, because cradling the child to their bodies would make their sweat intermingle with the child's sweat, and the child would not be Dutch anymore. The child would be contaminated by Indonesian and become Indonesian rather than Dutch. So that is this very strange parallel to what you just described.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is sort of racial biases coming from as early as 2 months old or in the fetus. So is this preventable?
I think what's preventable is education. I mean, that we can actually, again, that phrase, how we become reflective about our reflexes is part of what education does. It's one of the things that short circuits your own prejudices, so you can say, wow, that doesn't work. Certainly when I went to Japan, and no one could tell me from my friend Marivon, I mean, I think of myself as pretty unracist and could come up with all kinds of reasons, but until I was in a situation where I could see people literally looking at the two of us and saying, now, which one are you again? And then two or 5 minutes later saying, Now you're the one again, and I couldn't even keep it straight, which was which. It made me rethink my own racial views in such a more profound way. And I think, again, that's why we read literature, to identify with characters who aren't like ourselves, and to get that, to see that perspective. Looking back at it, it's why we play a game. It's why we try to be in educational situations that don't just mirror our world. On the flip side of this, and this is something that race theory talks about a lot, is if you're not reflective about your reflexives, you're vulnerable.
Yes.
You're vulnerable to them in all kinds of situations. We live in a global world that is complex and not a white world anymore. And not, colonialism, there is a global 1%, doesn't happen to be a global white 1%. What that means to you to live in a world where people in very powerful positions don't reflect your race, I think helps to contest, deconstruct, undermine your prejudices. But sometimes it's a painful process. Sometimes it really is a process where you have to go very deep and say, where did that come from? And what are these reflexes I have that I don't want to have?
Great. So I'd like to talk about some literary examples. Now you both are literature professors. So what are your favorite examples, maybe where race, prejudice, or political correctness, any of these ideas come up? And you touched on it a little bit, Kathy, but why are these important?
Well, one of the recommended readings this week was To Kill a Mockingbird. And I had not read that since maybe junior high school. And I was not only struck by how powerful it was and emotional it was, but also, although it's an ambiguous book where the characters are not, actually Atticus is kind of amazing. The characters are pretty clear-cut. And that made me feel good because often when I'm being interviewed, I get asked for positive characters in literature, and I'm always like a deer in headlights. I can never come up with like clear-cut examples. And from now, I'm just going to say Atticus Finch for everything, whenever anyone asks me a question. But it also made me think about the difference between literature that primarily has an audience of adolescents and literature that we think of as great literature for adults. So often in great literature for adults, it's not about the Atticus Finch who's able to stand up and be honorable against great odds, and who's willing to be possibly threatened, his own life and his children's life, and even his children's life threatened in order to stand up for a principle. Often in adults, in serious masterpieces of adult literature, the main character is somebody who gives in, or might be prejudiced, or might be the negative. And I think the reason for it is because the writer is trying to make you identify and understand something heinous or weak or non-heroic, in order that we then see those qualities in ourselves and become more reflective about those qualities in ourselves. Heroism we can admire, but it often doesn't change our behavior. We admire it. And I think there's probably, if you could weigh it, there's probably lots more young people's literature with great and heroic characters than there is serious, very, very so-called masterpieces of the lead literature. Now, there probably are other examples. Maybe I just read grim books. I mean, I really do tend to think of, my favorite books are not necessarily the happiest books around.
But we can also learn on the negative side, no?
Sure.
From those characters. Any favorite examples?
On the negative side, yeah. Probably my favorite book, which was also a children's book at the time, is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And there you've got this incredibly autocratic ship captain, who we might say is the symbol of the state or power, and then the world of the people on the ship. Now, interestingly, the reason I chose that book about racism is Melville, as a person who was a white from an elite background and went to sea very early, really hated racism. I don't think he felt like he necessarily could get out of it himself by who he was, but he hated living in a society in the 19th century where slavery existed. He hated living in a racist society, and really in his diaries and his notebooks, chafed against what a stupid thing racism was. And when he was on shipboard, he was constantly intermingling with people from all different races. But at the same time, that book is hardly race-free. It's a very, very race-conscious book and a complicated and contradictory book. But for me, a fascinating look at how people in the small microcosm of a ship interact together.
Yeah. Professor Koh, did any certain literary examples get you involved in this field or spark your interest?
I was actually thinking that I wanted to write the game because of the limitations I found through literature. So especially teaching literature.
Yeah.
Teaching literature, when you read a book, you assume that you identify with the perspective that other people identify with. And speaking as a person of color, when I started teaching literature, especially when I started teaching works that had been written by or about people of color, I was very shocked by how my students would read these texts in a really, really, really different way than I would assume they would have read them. And even though literature and film are very, very moving ways of getting people to identify and empathize with different points of view, you can always say, well, that's just not part of my experience. I don't identify with that. Well, maybe some people have those lives, but this is not part of a real everyday life. And so I thought that maybe writing a role-playing game which really, really tries to make you inhabit that kind of ideological perspective by making it part of your victory objective would be a way out of that. And even if I know some students, just like some people, are going to fight those perspectives, it's another way of entering that I think a literary text or a film or a TV show is more passive.
Right,
I
certainly.
think. It's more passive than actually having to create your own reality by playing that game.
And it's sneaky in the most wonderful way. I have such admiration for this, that you can inhabit a character whose position you don't agree with, but then it's your job, if you're going to win the game or have the right outcome, to defend that and do as much research as possible and really get inside the rhetoric of that game.
Right.
It's a really fascinating way to force you to think about your own rhetorical prejudice. It's kind of culture shock.
Right.
It's almost, you're put in a situation of culture shock. Do people choose? How do people choose who their character is going to be?
Reacting to the past games, the people who play these games and assign these games try to advise that the professors select students to be in certain roles, and usually they try to advise you to play more than one reacting game in a class as well, so that you can have a person playing a major role in one game and a minor role, more supporting role in the other game, so that you won't get tired out. And also because you get a range. Because some games are really important. You need to have somebody who is really going to be able to get people's attention and move things and do things. And some people are going to be more supporters or decision makers on what's going to happen. So I imagine you could have a game where people choose their roles, but if you are allowed to choose your role, usually you would choose what makes you less uncomfortable.
Right.
And the whole point of the game is to make you grapple with what's uncomfortable. Of course, you can also argue that how does a professor know what makes you comfortable and what makes you uncomfortable? And some people argue maybe that's why the professor only assigns those roles towards the middle of the class when he or she has gotten to know you better.
So I want to open this up a little bit more, not just to racial discrimination, but we've seen some controversial Duke Chronicle articles recently, excuse me. One relating to wage discrimination based on gender, one related to affirmative action, so a lot of backlash against those. So something that Professor Airley touched upon was that he thinks that we are overly politically sensitive, and that sort of inhibits necessary discourse that needs to happen. So what do you guys think about this?
I think that it reminds me of the example that you brought up earlier of the PBS documentary and what Kathy's response to it was, where certain reactions can become really, really explosive if it's too close to current things that are setting off emotional reactions. So I think it would depend on what context you're talking about, what kinds of issues you're talking about. There are lots of issues that are very deeply political and emotional to people from other parts of the world that aren't going to really affect students here. The concept of race, for example, is really interesting. So race and affirmative action. I have a history undergraduate student called David Saki, who has been working with me on designing and creating racist game. And he's been writing a Ghanaian student character from 2003 for the game. And it's it's been a very interesting process because David and I have been exploring Ghanaian history together. And when he first started writing the game and writing his character, he said, people in Ghana don't think about race. And I said, okay, you need to go back and look at your historical text because the way in which you understand race may not be the same way that Americans understand race, but there's similar gradations, similar processes. So let's talk about how we can connect those processes.
Oh, interesting.
But his observation here that people in Ghana, Africans in Ghana, don't see race because everybody is African and everybody's black, it's an interesting idea and it's parallel in many parts of the world. So, for example, I'm from Singapore, and I often tell people that I had no idea I was Asian, I really was Asian, until I came to the United States. And then suddenly it was banged on my head, oh, look, Asian person walking around. So, okay, I'm Asian, I guess I am, I'm in a box now. And so in that sense then, you know, if there were lots of issues in race that would be very, very sensitive in Singapore, that if you said that to somebody on a Duke campus, like, why would I care?
Yeah.
Right? So I think it depends on geographical context, historical context, and but there are lots of ways in which you can talk to bring them together.
I mean, I think the experiment that Dan does that's fascinating about so-called political correctness is the one where you're actually face-to-face with somebody of a different race, and he counts how long it takes you to use, and you're supposed to identify, I'm getting the setup confused, but you use markers to identify a third person?
It's sort of like a guess who game, and you're trying to figure out who it is. And so people don't want to ask the question, are they black or white?
Right, the white people will go to any length to say, ooh, don't ask is it black or white. There's a comic who writes for the Conan O'Brien show who's constantly doing skits based on that. The white people won't ever, they pretend I'm not black at all. They no, you're just a white person. And he does a very funny whole set of routines about that. The flip is, and a lot of comics talk about this too, Louis C.K. is somebody I think is quite brilliant. He does a wonderful shtick on racism, and he himself was born in Mexico. His mother's Mexican and Mayan, and he does this whole thing where he talks to people about racism, and other white people will get deeper and deeper into racist stuff before he flips it and then starts talking about his Mexican mother and that he's Mexican, and the difference between people being frank with him when they think he's a white person and then getting really freaked out when it turns out he looks white, but he's got a whole different background than that. And he talks about how there's a backlash to the backlash. So now it's like a far worse thing to describe somebody as being racist. No, to say somebody is racist is worse than being racist. That's kind of strange. You know, that the backlash of the backlash has happened so much that, like, the worst thing you can do is tell somebody that they're a racist when they're being racist. That's a very odd development, and whatever part of that is attributable to political correctness, it's also attributable to a long and deep history that we have to deal with. That goes back to your comment that we have to understand race. We have to be race conscious before we can understand race blindness.
I'd like to move on now to sort of a local topic, is the recent Duke Kappa Sigma fraternity party that was held at an off-campus house. The party was called Asia Prime, I believe. Students dressed up, wearing rice hats and sumo suits, sort of perpetuating Asian stereotypes. And I'd like to ask Dan about his opinion of this. There was a lot of backlash related to it from the Asian Student Alliance and other students on campus who labeled it as a racist rager. And so sort of the backlash and the protests got a lot of national attention. So were these students unfairly treated? Is this racism? What are your thoughts on it?
So first of all, nobody invited me to the party, so I don't know anything about that. Second, I'm Asian. So I grew up in Israel, and Israel is in Asia officially. It's the line for me. So I think as an Asian, I can relate to this. I don't know the details of what's going on, and I didn't see any of the pictures and the discussions, but I think people basically have really bad sense of humor, and I think this is not just about this in general. I think the bad sense of humor is just so terrible. If you can't tell jokes about race, I mean, there's not that much that is left. And we should be a bit more a bit more open about this. I would basically look at the intentions of people, right? Mm-hmm. And if somebody was a little bit offended, but nobody intended to do it, just get over it. From what it seems to me is that this is just something that started relatively innocent, with a relatively approach to a sense of humor, and then people became overly sensitive. Now, maybe they had the right reason to, and so on. But as we become a place that has so much political correctness and no ability to express some thoughts, I think it's a kind of an oppressive environment. So I'm hoping that, just imagine what happens if you have an Asian party and some people get upset, and what parties could you have at the end?
Right.
Just alcohol, that's it, that's all the thing we can do. So I think somehow we need to develop a sense of humor. We need to allow people to get over this initial indignation of somebody's using my race and so on, and look at the power of it. And what's interesting is that it seems like people within a culture can make fun of that culture, or that people from the outside of the culture are not allowed to. And I'm not sure why this is the case, but as being Jewish, I'm very happy to tell Jewish jokes. You remember there was a Seinfeld episode when he complained about this dentist, and this dentist who was telling Jewish joke, he was very offended, and then he converted. And Seinfeld thought that the only reason the dentist converted was that he could tell Jewish jokes with no repercussion. So there's something about kind of the inside group and outside group, and how much you can make fun of the group. But I think we just need to be a bit more calm about it.
And I think that's completely connected to some of the contradictions that color blindness has brought us to. So we have to be so blind that we don't see color, but we do see color, or evidently we do see color, but we have to pretend that we are so blind that we don't see color.
Right. So I think the last question we wanted to get to, something our group is really interested in. We don't need to put you guys on the spot, but something that's affecting colleges today, affirmative action. We touched on it before, but what are your guys' views on this, and what are valid and invalid arguments when it comes to talking about affirmative action?
I get very confused that so much of the affirmative action talk is just about race. Because I've sat on many scholarship committees and admissions committees at Duke, and there's like 20 different factors we're considering. Like, wow, this person is from was homeschooled at a tiny town in Nevada where there were only grizzly bears around. We gotta hire, but their test scores aren't as good. They're great. How do we know what their grades are? They were homeschooled. They're not as good a student. But look, how interesting to have somebody who only grew up with grizzly bears intermingling with kids from Manhattan. That's what you do. That's why you have an education. Or I was recently talking at the University of California at Irvine, where an admissions counselor told me, and I've mentioned this before in here, that the median grade point average of an entering student at the University of California at Irvine is 4.1 on a 4.0 scale, because California is one of those states that's gotten rid of affirmative action. Well, so you're going to school with a bunch of people who are academic hyperachievers. How does that possibly prepare you for the real world? And we know that those grades are based on such a narrow swath through the whole world of thinking that we do. Also, if I'm very proud that my state of California doesn't allow affirmative action anymore, if I live in Nevada, I can get into California schools much easier than I can if I'm in California, because I can pay out-of-state tuition. In fact, every state university in the country is now busily doing affirmative action on behalf of kids who don't live in their state in order that they can collect the higher tuition rate. It's gender. If you don't have general equality, if you don't factor out for gender things, you're going to have a disproportionate number of women than men at colleges, because women in this historical moment do better on the factors that are standardized testing, grades, AP tests than males do. There's so many different factors that we put in the pot. So why I'm suspicious of the fact that suddenly we get worried about one factor when there's so many other factors that we consider are important for the education of the aggregate. And that part of a face-to-face, just today a study came out about face-to-face education versus online education. And employers say they don't really care about if it's a fancy private school, a fancy public school, a little less for a more regional public school, a regional private school, a for-profit or a non-profit. What they don't want is online. Why? Because the aggregate experience of multiple students from diverse backgrounds together adds something to those students' lives that they take to the workforce that they don't get anyplace else, because our society is so rigidly segregated in just about all other contexts. So it's fascinating to me that there's such a push to say no affirmative action, but what we really mean is no affirmative action on behalf of African Americans.
Right.
And that it's very, very, very specific in that way.
In my game, there is written into the role descriptions, there is a conflict that Bell Hooks' character brings up. And in the game, the colorblind side is composed of Warwick Connolly, the plaintiff for affirmative action, Jennifer Gratz, and Carl Cohen, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Michigan, who argues against affirmative action. So Jennifer Gratz, so the Bell Hooks character is supposed to attack Jennifer Gratz's character by saying that historically, white American women have always been fighting for affirmative action. And the whole second wave feminist movement really was about affirmative action, getting women in the workplace. So she's then supposed to ask Jennifer Gratz as part of her victory objective, what happens? Why this backlash against affirmative action when it's no longer about you? When it's no longer about gender, white women, when it's about including race, why is there this backlash? And it's a very interesting point that the character brings up, precisely because Jennifer Gratz was the plaintiff in the undergraduate case, and the other person Barbara Gruder, who was in the case against the law school, both of them consistently bring up how they have experienced discrimination as women, and so that's why they're against all kinds of discrimination. So it's the same rhetoric, but it's totally twisted in a different kind of way.
Great. Well, thank you both professors for joining us today. This was really fascinating for us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but this was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.